after thoroughly visiting Sri Lanka or Ceylon, we took the bus back to the airport in Colombo, and the next day continued on this journey to Singapore. We had received an invitation from a woman who worked for GE in Singapore and invited us to stop by and talk to her about possibly running an ICW in Singapore. So the idea of visiting Singapore was exciting to us because of the history we had heard about Singapore and the famous authors that had visited there. Famous bar Raffles was described as early as the 1900s, and a famous drink called the Singapore Sling was served. So we willing, and we were fairly close from Sri Lanka to Singapore, so that it was a fairly short trip in the right direction going. We were going now in an easterly direction, and they expected to spend 2 weeks in Australia. Anyway, it was worthwhile going to Singapore, which is a small island, probably not much larger than Central Park in New York. And we got there during the day and registered at a hotel, and we were still with the group that we had spent 3 weeks with in India. So we had friends to share our voyage in Singapore. Anyway, we found the island very interesting. It was very well built up with huge buildings, a great deal of industry taking place in a small area, and noted for its cleanliness. We understood that nobody dropped a cigarette butt on the street because that could be a $200 fine for doing so. And it was interesting for us to see it. Singapore itself was quite warm in that time of the year. I think it was somewhere in about April by the time we got there. And the temperatures were in the 80s, high 80s and low 90s. We went to sleep because we were tired, and when we got up in the morning, we started our explorations. One of the areas to explore was the seaport. Being Singapore as an island and had many ships stopping off, bringing goods for the Singaporeans to process and then shipping them out when they were things that they had made. We visited the seaport, and an interesting thing happened. When we finished the sightseeing of the seaport, we got back to Singapore, the island itself, and it started to rain. And we wanted to go back to our hotel, and we saw a line of people waiting for taxis. And there must have been 20 or so passengers waiting for individual taxis, and that line was moving very slowly. So we said Babe and I said to ourselves, we're really not that far from the hotel, and we do have umbrellas, and it seems silly to wait here online for a taxi. So we started walking towards the direction of the hotel, and it started to rain a little harder, and there was a truck waiting online to get into traffic, and I walked over to the truck and tapped on the driver's window and said to him that we couldn't get a taxi. I'd be glad to pay him to take us to the Taj Hotel where we were staying and pay him for it. He said, I'd be glad to do it for nothing. Just get in the truck, and we're not far from the hotel. So we got into his truck, and he started driving us to the hotel, and I asked him questions about what he was doing in Singapore. He hadn't, I think he was Japanese or Chinese, and he described his job and what it was like working in Singapore. And he delivered us to the hotel and refused to take any money. It was really a very pleasant experience. So that was part of our trip. We had to be back in the hotel to meet this lady who worked for GE, and she took us to the restaurant, the huge restaurant in that hotel. And like most restaurants in that area, and we found in other places that we went to, big hotels had 3 restaurants. One Chinese, and one that was typical of the environment, in this case of Singapore, and another restaurant, French. So you had three restaurants you could choose to go to, and she had picked the Chinese restaurant. So when we got in there, it was beautiful, and we looked at the menu, and she said, would you like to try bird's nest soup? And I looked at the menu, and bird's nest soup was around $100. And I said, no, I don't think so. We'll have the soup of the day. And I just didn't feel like spending that kind of money, although GE would have paid for it without any question. Anyway, we had a very nice lunch at this place, and a good time with the lady we were visiting, and we probably spent a couple of hours finishing our dinner, and talked about ICW. and she thought that it would be a long way to go to send 2 instructors to Singapore, and there weren't enough GE people working in Singapore to spend the kind of money involved. So that idea was dropped. We asked her about where we should have dinner that night, and she said there's an interesting sight to see in a park. There's a place where they small merchants had set up places where they had cooking arrangements, and there were maybe 20 or 30 of them that had their own restaurants, which in a way reminds me of the restaurants and farmers market in Ithaca. And the difference being that there were many more restaurants individually. There were probably 20 restaurants with people cooking, and there were tables where you would sit down to receipt. You choose the food from these small restaurants and pay for it. And there were waitresses who then would pick up the food when it was finished and bring it to your table. And the food was delicious and the setting was beautiful. It was a memorable kind of dinner to have because you had wide choices, 20 different people cooking, and all delicious dishes. Anyway, that's where we had dinner that night. And another thing we went to see in the morning was young brides and grooms celebrating their recent weddings in the park, all dressed up and with the guests that they had invited to view their wedding, followed them as they walked through the park, taking pictures at beautiful spots. And it was a very interesting thing for us to see that as a typical wedding event in Singapore. Another thing we had decided to do in Singapore was at least to visit their famous Raffles restaurant that had been in existence there for about 100 years, and famous authors had gone there to visit the bar called Raffles, and a bartender at the Raffles restaurant and bar had invented a drink called the Singapore Sling in the early 1900s, and it was still being concocted and served at this Raffles restaurant. So we found out how to go there, and it seemed like there were buses that made the trip from our hotel to Raffles. And so we got on the bus, and Babe and I, that is, and went to the Raffles restaurant. On the way, Babe put her hand down on the seat of a bus and came up with a Citizen's Watch, which was a fairly expensive thing, and it seemed like it would be rather impossible to find out the owner of it, so she decided to keep it. And that was an interesting thing, and so she had that memorabilia of that bus ride, and we got to the restaurant and had ordered Singapore slings and spent an hour or so walking around there. It was really an ancient place, 100 years old, and it was memorabilia, and we saved the swizzle sticks that were that came with the drink. So while we were only in Singapore 2 or 3 days, we did a lot, saw a lot, was very impressed by this island. The island itself was was doing a very good business, and was probably one of the most successful small islands in the sea at that point. The next day we started out for our next easterly visit, going to Australia. And our first stop in Australia was the area of the Great Barrier Reef, where we intended to do a lot of snorkeling. But as I recall, it rained for a few days, and we shifted our trip slightly to riding around in buses, exploring the interior of Australia, at least the interior away from the sea, to get an idea of what Australia was like in the mountains. What we found was that there was a lot of land and really empty land. There were hills and mountains and lots of land, but very few people. As a matter of fact, at that time, which was 25 years ago, I think the population of Australia was somewhere around 12 million people. And when you think that the continent of Australia was about the size of the United States, it gives you some thoughts about how big the land area was and how few people were there. Anyway, we drove around for a few days in the through the mountains and hills, and saw what it was like. And then when the weather cleared, we flew to a little island that was part of the Great Barrier Reef, and did some snorkeling and sightseeing in the water. And temperature of the water was beautiful, and there was a lot to see. And we spent 2 or 3 days on that island, and got acquainted with the reef itself. After that, we had intended to spend a week up there, So our week was over, and we headed down for the two big cities uh, in Australia that was nearest to nearest to the Great Barrier Reef, in that area in the northeast of the continent. And the two big cities were Melbourne and Sydney. Uh, we had intended to spend a few days in the Melbourne area because that's where the tennis matches, the Australian tennis matches, were held once a year. We wanted to see what that was like. And there was a lot of parks, and that's where we saw most of the kangaroos that we first laid eyes on in the parks around Melbourne. And it was interesting for us to see these animals, very friendly, running and jumping, and larger than we thought from having seen the movies and pictures of them. After a couple of days in Melbourne, we visited the Sydney Opera House, which was built on one of the islands in that seaport. It was a beautiful, modern city, and the Opera House was very exciting for us. I think we went to see a performance of an opera there, but it's been so long ago I can't remember which opera it was. And after a couple of days, that completed our tour of Australia. Not very exciting, but going back and thinking about it, it was really a big empty place with few people and very nice land sites to see. Anyway, we took off from Sydney and headed east for our last vacation stops, which was in the French Tahitian Islands. And that was very exciting for us because we had been used to the islands and the people of the Caribbean, and the Tahitian Islands were different. I must say that our impression was that the islands were peaceful and low, in that they weren't peaks of mountains sticking up through the water. They weren't created by volcanoes, and with most of the island under the water and just the tops of them sticking out. The Tahitian Islands were quite different. They were beautiful beaches, and they had reefs around, coral reefs around them. So if you wanted to go into the water, you went like into a beautiful beach and beautiful sea, and in the distance you had these coral reefs surrounding central waterhole. And we landed from Australia. We flew into Tahiti, which is the biggest island and probably the most business-like community of the Tahitian islands. Not the kind of islands you would want to visit on a vacation. So we landed in Tahiti and spent the afternoon and evening, and then went to sleep and got up the next morning and flew to a nearby island called Moorea, which was very, very beautiful, with great beaches and great swimming holes. And we spent about 10 days there. And it was just beautiful, peaceful, and the natives are so different. They welcome you, they take care of you, they're happy to fondle little children, so that families coming there with kids could kind of give up the care of their children to these pleasant ladies who worked mostly as waitresses in the restaurants on the island of Moorea. We spent just a lovely week on Moorea and looked forward to visiting Bora Bora, which we had heard was the most beautiful of all the islands in Tahiti. We flew into Bora Bora on a seaplane from Moorea, probably a distance of 40 or 50 miles, and landed in this central lagoon with a beautiful island all around it, and Moorea and Bora Bora itself was absolutely gorgeous. So we had a week there. We took trips on taxis around the island, saw most of it, and the story of South Pacific took place it was supposed to anyway, on the island of Bora Bora. And the songs describe the hills and the beauty of this gorgeous place. One of the interesting things that we did while we were on this island was to go out on a trip that was called Feeding the Sharks. And the way this was done, you had a large canoe that held maybe 20 people, and they canoed you out to the reef that surrounded the bay of Bora Bora, and you got out of your canoe and into the water. And what the island people did was to have a large supply of fish, cut up fish, and you got into the water and held on to a rope or a line, and with snorkels you looked at in what was going on in the water, and there were dozens of sharks that had been trained to come to this area to feed on the fish that they islanders threw out into the sea, and they were kind of vying with each other to get as much fish as they could. It was really a scary sight because you're lying in the water on the surface with your with your masks on, and watching this excitement going on with sharks chasing each other to get the food, and looking behind you at your feet and wondering if there were any sharks in back of you. That was an exciting part of the trip, but organized and with trained sharks that were used to coming there at a particular time of day when they would be fed these fish. I didn't have a camera with me, but several of the people that were in this canoe with us took pictures of the feeding of the sharks, and one of them promised to send me copies, but I never did. I never did receive them. We spent a week on Bora Bora, and I must say, of this 9-week trip that we took around the world, Bora Bora was the most beautiful of the places we had visited, and the people that inhabited this island were just charming, friendly, and just lovely to be on the island with them and go to eat in their restaurants and talk to the people. The girls who worked as waitresses always came in the morning with fresh flowers in their hair, and the way they walked and the smiles that they gave to the guests visiting their islands was quite different from what we expected from visiting the Caribbean islands. After spending 2 delightful weeks in the French Polynesian islands, our vacation and our trip of 9 weeks around the world was coming to an end. We flew back to Tahiti, the Big Island, and the next day took the plane that brought us back to the U.S. And California. If I think about it, the idea of flying business class around the world was the only way to go, and we were perfectly satisfied and looking forward to getting back home and renewing my career with General Electric in Crotonville on the Hudson.